Today, we're going to be looking at a deathmatch that I recorded recently. It has mouse cam footage as well. We're going to analyze and break down the mechanics. We're going to score it, and I'm hoping that I do well. And I'm hoping that also this helps you guys to be able to kind of figure out what you should be focusing on, what it could look like, and just generally bring you into my process as I go through it. So we'll keep things relatively simple and score just a few metrics to begin with for episode 1. At the end of the video, I'll give scores and I'll talk about what I can do to address the areas where I can improve. Crosshair placement. This is the general crosshair placement skills. How good I am at snapping between angles of focus, maintaining position on the angles as I move, adjusting my crosshair on the angle for whether I think the opponent will swing quickly or slowly, and so on. Efficiency of mouse lines between angles. So we want clean lines between each angle as this is more efficient. So if there are movements here that I'm struggling with and the angles are kind of wonky from A to B, it's good to identify, where that's happening and why. And then lastly, arm and wrist usage and aiming from neutral. Generally, we want to be aiming from a neutral position as this is the most efficient way to aim. The arm movements are really good for the bigger repositions that if I were to use my wrist instead, would mean that I'm trying to aim from a position that's off neutral. And we don't want that, so let's avoid it as best we can. So I'm going to throw up my settings and my pad and my mouse and so on up on the screen for reference purposes. But otherwise, I think, in this opening sequence, I'm actually kind of happy. I've been trying to focus on the 180s being mostly arm dominated so that I can really have the freedom of the wrist movements from neutral after I make that flick, which makes things a lot more consistent. So I'm pretty happy again with this opening sequence. Definitely going to be scoring well so far, but we'll see how that goes as the video continues. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the term neutral position in this context of mouse control, essentially it means that when you're aiming with your wrist, that your wrist is in a centered position so that you're able to have the most range left and right of that middle kind of neutral position. And that's going to be a lot more comfortable and consistent with regards to aiming. Whereas if you imagine that you're kind of trying to aim, let's say left or right, and your wrist is already all the way to the right or to the left, that's going to be very awkward and difficult and not very consistent. So that's what I mean about being in a neutral position. So in terms of crosshair placement, just checking in on that, I think things are looking pretty good so far. Generally speaking, you're going to be looking at your ability to maintain your position on the angles as you move, that compensation. So that's kind of tracking skill, precision tracking. And then also, snapping between the angles, the pre-aim, how accurate and clean and efficient all that is. So far, so good. It's always a little bit weird in deathmatch because, crosshair placement is informed by what you expect to be happening in the game. And, obviously in deathmatch, you don't really have much information. You're just aiming at anything. So you need to kind of just imagine, okay, well, what are the common angles I would kind of be focusing between? And then practice those ones, especially the ones that you think are more difficult. This is a good place to get reps for that. Another thing we had was the efficiency of line between two angles. And, so far, I think that's looking pretty good as well. Generally, there are small elevation changes in a game like Valorant. Nothing too drastic, though. So you're often just keeping things at that head height. And so you're just operating on that plane. So I would say that that's actually not too difficult of a skill in general. And from what we're seeing, flicking between the angles for crosshair placement and so on, it's looking quite clean. We're not getting any wobbles going up and down off of that horizontal axis. So generally pretty happy so far with that as well. As I say that, of course, there are a couple wobbles and we're seeing a little bit of a diversion from that horizontal axis, and we're actually kind of, raising the mouse above those. I'm noticing that that's happening a lot on some of the bigger flicks in general, the kind of what I call positional flicks, where I'm looking to turn a pretty large amount of degrees. And I think that's okay. I have been off for about a week at the point of recording this. So with that said, with some more practice, I think that will even out a little bit. So this sequence here on Cat is quite nice. And I think that it shows a good kind of combination of all of these skills kind of put together. One thing I think that's worth noting is you can really see that I go for that initial big flick and then there's a micro adjustment. And that's exactly the technique that you want to be training when you're doing 6-shot in AimLab, or when you're doing, the big wall with the small targets on the voltaic benchmark. And that's why I like to train those so much, because this is the most common thing that you'll be doing when you're flicking in this game is, you're often not going to be directly on the target on the first flick. So having a really good technique for that first flick and then the micro adjustment is really, really helpful. Okay, so it's time to score and give my feedback and solutions. So overall, I'm going to give crosshair placement a 9 out of 10. Feedback for this is that I'm pretty happy with it. To get a score of 10, I'll need to see more footage on different maps, I think, as I believe Ascent is one of the easier maps for crosshair placement due to the geometry of the map. In terms of tracking, flicking, pre-aiming, and all the rest of it, it's looking pretty solid in this video. I can improve this by just focusing on good crosshair placement principles and up my playing time, but yeah, I don't see any glaring issues. Efficiency of mouse lines between angles. This is going to get an 8 out of 10. My feedback is that I feel like this is pretty wobbly on some of the bigger positional flicks, and in general, I also remember it feeling a little unstable. And in addition to practicing Deathmatch as a solution, I can resolve this by putting in some hours on switching tasks in AimLab, as well as the big wall, small dots tasks as well. If this problem persists, which it tends not to after I'm a little more trained, then I'll have to reassess and see if there's an underlying issue, such as a sensitivity pad, my wrist, and my arm technique. The next would be the arm and wrist usage, and I'm going to give this a 6.5 out of 10. It's pretty rough. My feedback here is that although I feel I compensate pretty well due to the experience, I think I can improve the consistency of this significantly. I need to set a rule for the sense I'm using currently as to how much arm or wrist I'm using specifically for certain turns. So my solution is that I think I need to use the wrist solely in moving like 45 degrees left or right of neutral, but anything greater should be an arm movement. And this is going to take a lot of deliberate practice to encourage this as a new habit. All right, I think that does it. I have some good points to focus on when I'm continuing my training. And I hope this video was insightful for you guys. If you liked it, please leave a comment as to what you liked about it or what I could do differently. That would be helpful. Otherwise, remember to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheers.